Would it be realistic to get advance sight of the white paper, for example, when it's sort of finally decided, or anything on those lines?
Probably. That would only be a number of days, so...
Okay, so that would still be useful for investment?
Yeah, for a bit of a account site.
Absolutely, I could guarantee you would get that within 48 hours of publication, for example.
Before publication?
Yeah, I would make some advances, making sure that happens.
Great.
So, as you might imagine, before we undertake any sort of undercover, there's quite an elaborate process, both editorial and legal, at the newspaper. And with this, we'd heard allegations from senior political sources that the gambling industry was securing support from MPs in exchange for financial reward. And there were some specific allegations about some specific MPs, which led to us emailing 8 MPs, of which Scott Benton was one.
And were you surprised? I mean, only a couple of weeks ago we had that story about, Matt Hancock and Kwasi Kwarteng. It's not just taking money when people might say, well, you ought to be getting on with your job as an MP, but laying out in so much detail what he was willing to do in exchange for money.
Yeah, I think one of the most remarkable things about this was how much he was just volunteering these different things he was prepared to do. I asked him. I said we were talking to PR companies and to lobbying firms, and we were just trying to understand what a politician could offer that would be different to what they could offer, and that just led to this sort of shopping list of things he was seemingly willing to do, of which he's not allowed to do.
We vote in House Commons 2 or 3 times a day. The minister has to pass you, and then you've got 10 minutes while you walk around to the next vote to have his ear. There's written questions as well, where we can table things on the public record and get an instant response within 5 working days. And thirdly, we have access to papers and information which PR companies would.
Tabling questions, approaching ministers, all sorts of things, leaking a white paper, even though that is very likely to contain market-sensitive information. And we said, that would be great. We can make money from that.
Would it be realistic to get advance sight of the white paper, for example, when it's sort of finally decided, or anything on those lines?
Probably. That would only be a number of days, so...
Okay, so that would still be useful for investment?
Yeah, for a bit of a account site.
Absolutely, I could guarantee you would get that within 48 hours of publication, for example.
Before publication?
Yeah, I would make some advances, making sure that happens.
Great.
I mean, he's a bit younger than me, but it's extraordinary he can't remember Cash for Questions, which literally helped contribute to the fall of the Tory government in the 90s. The literal exchange of money for tabling parliamentary questions.
Yeah, and since then, several other scandals along the years, along similar lines. I mean, it was only 2 years ago that we had the Owen Paterson lobbying scandal, which was slightly different to this, but breaching lobbying rules, and the rules were tightened in the wake of that. Those new rules came into effect less than a week before we met him, and yet still seemingly he was completely unaware or willing to break them.
And the interesting point about this, which maybe lots of people don't know, is the I saw someone talk about this morning, the tentacles of the gambling industry and the way it's woven through Parliament. It gives us a sense of how it is that this particular industry has exerted influence in Westminster.
So we're in the midst of a major review of gambling laws, the first time that the laws are being looked at since 2005, and a review has been going on since late 2020 into that. And that's a hugely significant review for the gambling industry. That there are some really tough regulations being considered that could have a huge impact on profits. And so the gambling industry has been particularly engaged in the last few years in trying to win support for its arguments that you don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and problem gambling is only a very small problem, they argue, and we don't want to impede on the ability of millions to enjoy a punt. So they've been very involved in doing things like paying for corporate hospitality for dozens of MPs. They've paid for some MPs to be hired as consultants, not lobbying, so not against the rules, but nevertheless receiving financial reward. And then there's been a lot going on in behind the scenes in the corridors of power to try and water down some of these proposals.
And it's amazing. Days out at Ascot, pop concerts. I mean, as well as just money in your pocket. And you just think, well, why would the gambling industry be doing that if it wasn't to try and exert?
Yeah, I think there's one MP who's received from the gambling industry something like 57 tickets to something like 57 events in a 5 or 6 year period. So the scale of it is quite extraordinary. I mean, Scott Benton touched on why companies do this in our conversation when we were undercover, and he said, it's an opportunity to bend the ear of MPs over a glass of wine. And he also said, and this would be against the rules, quite often MPs are willing to do a favour in return if they've been taken out to a day at the races or to a pop concert. They'll table a question for you, or they'll try and find out some information that would be useful.
And so where does this go next? He's had the whip withdrawn, and he's referred himself to the Standards Commissioner. So there will now be an investigation poring over your evidence, essentially.
Exactly. There'll be a standards investigation. The Commissioner will come to a decision as to whether he's broken any rules or brought Parliament into disrepute. There's a range of punishments available. If he's suspended from Parliament and it's a long enough suspension, we may see a by-election.
Billy, it's an extraordinary story.